Diving right back in. In the last video, I ended a little bit early just because, our app is getting increasingly complex, and I wanted to make sure I could adequately describe what was happening. So, the question that we were trying to figure out before was, let me close out my email and stuff here. How do we determine which of these items we've currently clicked on? Because that's how we're going to know what to show the recipes for. Because we only want to show recipes that are created by one of these restaurants. So, in our event right here, I needed some way to get access to the current restaurant that we're looking at, specifically the this keyword. And actually, Meteor's so awesome, you can just grab the this item from each. So it just knows that if I click on my store, the this keyword will be set to the restaurant object with my store. And so in our code, you can see how I just said alert this.name, which is the same thing as getting the this.name over here. And so if I actually click on this, you see it'll say my store. If I click on this one, now it says my restaurant. Or this one, it says test 2. So, in order for, now if we want to, so basically what we want to do from here is we want to take the this and we want to get access to its underscore ID, right? So if I come back here into my application, I click on this, here's that crazy random generated ID, here's that other ID. And because we're going to use that ID, if I go back to my events here, so the first thing we're going to do is listen for the click on a list item, determine which restaurant was clicked using this. Then we want to grab the underscore ID of that restaurant using this dot underscore ID. And from here, we actually want to set a session value with the currently selected restaurant. So if we wanted to do that, we'll just do like session. And remember, whenever we're using session, we have to call set default. So here I'm going to say session.setDefault, and we'll put this to an empty object. Sorry, we'll call this selected restaurant, and we'll just set it to an empty object right now. Cool. And then from here, I want to be able to do session dot set the selected restaurant to this, which is our current restaurant. So sorry, I know that was a little different than how we did it before. So, oh, sorry, I guess I said we want to grab the ID of the restaurant using this.id, not just passing the restaurant around. So let me fix that. So we're actually just going, the selected restaurant, we'll change this to selected restaurant ID, and then we'll just do this underscore ID. You can pass these objects inside of collections around directly, but I tend to prefer to think about it in terms of IDs because that's how you create these relationships between our different collections. If I come back here, each recipe will have a created by field, and then we'll set it equal to that restaurant's ID. So now when we click on a restaurant, what I'd like to do is I'd like to show recipes for, and then put that restaurant's name right here. So here we have like restaurant.name. So let's create that helper. And actually, instead of calling it restaurant, let's say like selected restaurant. Now keep in mind the value that we put in here for this session, oh, we're actually going to replace this with and we'll actually just set it to null initially because we don't want any value there. So selected restaurant here doesn't refer to the session's selected restaurant. It's going to refer to the name of a template helper that we are currently creating. So just because they happen to be named the same thing, and actually, oh, sorry, we changed this to ID anyways, right? So selected restaurant will be the actual restaurant object that we'll get out of this collection, whereas this session value is just an ID. So in here, we'll do selected restaurant. We'll create that function. And now we need to query our restaurants collection to get the restaurant out with that ID. So say return restaurants.find 1, and then we would use the sessions selected restaurant ID field to find that. Now if we come back into our app, we'll say recipes for my restaurant. In this case, because the last thing we had selected was my restaurant. So if I do green pig, it says recipes for the green pig. Say recipes for my store, recipes for Cafe Rio. So let's just follow that event flow really quick. So we've got this LI that's repeating for each of the things from our restaurants, which we're returning by querying all the restaurants. Then when we click on a restaurant, so it's like if I click on the green pig, it triggers our click list item group function down here, where we set a session to the currently selected restaurant ID. And we get the current restaurant that they're clicking on by using the this keyword. So from there, well, as soon as we call session.set, because remember session is reactive, so if I go back to our notes, right, we have like an HTML event, which is a click, calls an event function, and then from there, once this event function is run, we change the session, which automatically triggers the selected restaurant helper to rerun because we're calling session.get inside of that function. And using that value, we requery the restaurants collection to find the one restaurant we're looking for using that ID. Then that's exposed into our HTML, and we grab the name off of it. So from there, what we need to do is, so now we can like click on the different restaurants, we can see it appear. Now I want to actually show a list of recipes. So the first thing we have to do is we actually have to add the ability to create recipes. So I'm going to go a little bit faster through this because it's the exact same as what we were doing for the restaurants, really. We're going to create a collection called recipes. And then in here, we now want to create a form for our recipes. So I'm just going to copy the same code that we had here. And from there, we'll change this now to recipe name. And then we need to add a new event for when they create a new recipe. So we'll say when they do a submit. And something you'll notice here is that since we were selecting by form group previously, that would grab both this form as well as this form. They would both run this function. So what we need to do is we need to add more specificity to our selector. So meaning just saying dot whatever isn't enough. We need to actually be able to identify the individual forms in this case, because one's for recipes and one's for restaurants. So probably the easiest way to do that is just to add an element ID. So we could say the ID is equal to, in this case, will be like restaurant form. And then over here, we will put the ID that we are selecting on this submit selector. So now we're not selecting by the class anymore. We are selecting by the ID, which is right here. Which means our other submit event that we started filling out will also need an ID. So here we'll say ID equals recipe form. So now when we say submit recipe form, this event function will only run when they hit enter for the recipe form item. And let's just go ahead and test if that's working. So we'll alert the value for that event out. So just to get access to the value, if you remember from the previous video, we'll do event.target, which is our form. Then we need to grab this input field using recipe name. So say recipe name, and then we will grab the value. So I type something in. There we go. And you'll notice it's doing the flickery thing, and it's messing with our URL and reloading the page and already clearing it out. So we're going to want to return false to override that default functionality. And then in here, just like what we were doing up above, we can insert our recipe. And now, a recipe, it could have a name, but just to make it a little bit clearer, we'll call it something different than the restaurants field. We'll just say that it is a, we'll call it a title. We'll set that title equal to the value they just put in that text field. And then we're actually going to clear out that text field while we're at it too. We don't need that alert anymore. So now, when we type something in here, it should automatically, and we hit enter, it should automatically create a new recipe for us. So we have to expose these recipes into our HTML. So let's go ahead and create our each block. So we'll say for each item in recipes, we want to generate one of those LI tags. Now, in order to do that, I'm basically just going to copy this chunk of HTML we had earlier because it's almost the exact same. So I'll actually just paste that in. And let's update this now. So it's not going to be each restaurant, it's going to be each recipes. And then it won't be this.name anymore, it'll be this.title because that's what we're calling the title of the recipe. And we don't need this little badge count thing because recipes aren't going to use that, so we can just delete that. Cool. So now the last step we have to do is we need to actually expose this list of recipes to our HTML using a helper. So let's go here to our helpers. We'll say recipes. Then we will return recipes.find. And that will return all of our recipes for us. So we don't have any recipes currently, so we'll just say like jam. So now we got a recipe for jam. Or bacon. We have a bacon recipe. But notice something. We can click around on these different things here and it will update saying recipe for test or recipe for other store. But these recipes don't have an owner currently. We have not set who owns them. So how will we do that? Well, the answer is going to be, we want to come in here into our recipes, and we're going to add this created by field. And that's going to be a restaurant ID. But how do we know which restaurant we're trying to get? Well, if you remember, our session has the currently selected restaurant ID saved on it. So we could actually just pull that. Say session.get and then pull selected restaurant ID off of it. Now, oops, no semicolon there. Now we have an easy way to say who the recipe was created by. Then up here, for our list of recipes we're returning, just like how we use session.get to get the current recipe ID, we basically only want to return the recipes that have, as their created by field, the selected restaurant ID. So to do that, we need to add a little bit more to this query call that we're creating. And let me just pull that up. And to do that, hold on one second. Let me just make sure I've got my code correct here. So I think we should just be able to say find everything where the created by field is equal to the current session selected restaurant ID. Not totally certain about that though, so let's give that a try. It looks like it's working. So ideally if we created a recipe here, so we'll say like pork salad. And then if we click around, sure enough, it won't show recipes for any other item other than the current one that we've selected. So none of these other restaurants have any recipes that they own, except for Cafe Rio, which then returns that pork salad recipe right there. Whoops, so I selected something else and I got off that. So here, the pork salad recipe has a created by field that's referencing this Cafe Rio object. So let me just clean up the syntax a little bit so you can read it better what I did. So you're used to seeing the default find call. But here we're passing in an object, which is basically a list of fields that we want to match our results. So I'll put this in a syntax you're probably more used to seeing. So here we've got our object inlined. So we're basically saying return all the recipes that have a created by field that's set to the current selected restaurant's ID. So whenever the current selected restaurant ID changes, since session is reactive, this helper will rerun and it will grab the new recipes that belong to that restaurant, and we'll see them over here in our list of recipe items. So I could actually add some more. So let's say like tacos and burritos. And now if I click around, none of the other restaurants have any item that belongs to them, but Cafe Rio has these three things. So if I go to my restaurant, I could be like, maybe we make toast or something. So now these other restaurants don't have any value, but if you go to my restaurant, it has toast, and Cafe Rio has pork salad, tacos, and burritos. So this is your pretty standard mapping between different collection items. Fundamentally, this is all your app is underneath the hood. It's just mappings between these different collections. So the most common mapping will be between a user account and a collection item. But you also will have mappings like this where maybe a restaurant has another has a certain list of items that are part of another collection that it belongs to. And the way to tie all those different pieces together is by using the underscore ID syntax. So I know it was a lot to making this app. We definitely went a little bit faster, and we're taking. There's a lot of pieces, right? So we've got a couple events going now. And a couple different helpers, and our HTML is looking a little bit more complicated and harder to read because we're using Bootstrap in it now. But this should be, if you understand this and you can get this down, then most of what you build in your apps won't be unnecessarily complicated. Sure, we have to figure out how to integrate with third-party libraries and, add other components and stuff to our app. But primarily, though, if you can understand this, you can probably build the majority of your application on your own. So definitely go back, rebuild this project if it's still confusing. Start over from scratch. Go through putting Bootstrap in your project and then building out your HTML and creating these events and stuff. And hang in there. It'll start to click soon enough.